Yeah. Um, Virtuality is my topic, so it kind of ties in with Jonathan's thing, although it's not from the point of view of semantics, obviously, in a sense. But there might be some dialogue between the two of us still. Might be some dialogue with fiction, but I'm not going to talk or use fiction at all. Maybe that's in the background, I don't know. So why do I want to talk about virtuality? I think the relationship between action and representation is one of my interest areas from various approaches, and it's interesting because different types of representations, whether active representations where we participate very actively, or movies, or they articulate this relationship differently. So from a kind of media studies perspective, action representation is interesting because you can use that as a tool to compare genres, comparing media technologies, and so on. So that's my broad sort of media studies kind of non-philosophical interest, I guess. And also it's interesting because of the tension, which has been, or the various types of conflicts between action and representation that has been formulated in different theories and by different authors, and I'm going to address one of them here. Real time is also my interest here. That explains the space war thing at the back here. I'm interested. It seems to me that the introduction of real time graphics with space war and later with action games is really a key object of study, and it has to do with the simulation of touch, and I think it is crucially important to understand what real-time is about if you want to answer the question or approach the question, what is the difference between computer games and other games. I think the best candidate for, the best way of doing it is looking at real-time, which I think is the key distinguisher in a way. Also, I'm interested in it as a modality of action. I'm interested in real time as a particular way of being engaged, not just as something that we look at. Referring a little bit to Jonathan's, you're looking at the screens and all I can see is screen and so on. Okay, but there is what I would call an imperative. In not all games, far from, but some games. They have as an imperative that you in some way or another have a prosthetic relationship to them in order to be able to proceed much in the game or experience more than 1% of the game. Otherwise, for example, in a shooter, you would just stand in a corner and walking into a corner. You need to establish some kind of intuitive relationship, a particular mode of experience, and you can say with Paul Martin, who's here, with Paul, that is one ingredient in the soup of the gamescape. So I'm interested in that particular ingredient in the soup, and I say that it's in many genres, it's that kind of intuitive relationship. You called it smooth, is a particularly important ingredient in the sense that you couldn't play very much without it. So that explains my interest in broadly virtual. So this is the object of study. 2DS. So I'm merely stating here that I suggest that we should refer to this media form or this game interaction form, and also this modality of interaction, that we should. I would suggest that we just call it virtuality. But there are a number of problems involved with that, of course. Jon Rikard Sageng's in-game action. This is also a kind of plug for the anthology that came out last year. So one way of articulating this relationship is to say that that action and representation is completely incompatible. You either try and do something in the world. I suppose this direction of fit is broadly familiar to most of you. You either do something intentionally, want to do something in the world, Or if we're looking at active fiction here, forget movies and so on, but if we're looking at fictions that we actually, or representations that we actually do, then you either really do something, or you really express something. You pretend that you do something, you know. And so that is the conclusion that we can draw from this way of approaching it, that you can't have action and representation at the same time. You can have two simultaneous actions, of course. You can pretend to kill someone and kill someone, or maybe you can't. In any case, you understand the difference. You either pretend to kill someone or you kill. So if, to the extent that this is an absolute incompatibility, you need to. Why is this slide here? Well, yes. Well, this incompatibility I prepared this morning. Has been formulated by many, not just in philosophy. This is Roger Calloway, so he's stating a similar thing. You know, that mimetic games and competition, they don't go. They're like oil and water. So this would be a kind of a cultural theory, sociological variant of Jon Rikard Sageng's position. When you dress up and play football, it's not really football. But if you're really playing football, it's not really dress up. You know, you got to fall down on one. And one way of explaining that is through direction of fit thesis. So this is how, more plugs for our book, this is how Jon Rikard articulates it. And the interesting part with this is what he calls a reference shift. So in order to act, this is with reference to computer games, in order to act, you need to get down to the real, because action can't be done on anything represented, because then it's not real action. Then it would be, I guess, a mimetic act or expression, or what, I don't know, but you can't do that. So in order to have a theory of action, we need to say that the proper action, intentional action, is directed at spatial-visual graphical shapes that he sees before him on the screen. So graphical shapes is what you see. So then it, of course, depends on what you mean by spatial-visual graphic shapes, and it depends on what you mean by seeing something. So there's a kind of, maybe a theory of perception, or at least some concept of perception that you need in order to make this work. What does it mean to see something? And that's where the phenomenological thing, I guess, comes in, which, you know, what does it mean to actually see something, and actually what does it mean to act intentionally? In mimetic games, this is not a problem. I suggest that this, Espen also addressed this dual model of playing and then representation as another layer, you know, a layered. That is a very convincing paradigm of thinking about representation. That you have an action layer, the real thing, and then there's a simulation sort of representation layer on top. And that is very, and that's in new media theory, very prominent in new media theory. That's you know, Calloway. You can go to different places, and it's very compelling, I think, because it's broadly right. It's broadly right, as long as you're talking about non-computer games, as long as you're not talking about real time. So my hunch is that when you're doing these kinds of mimetic games, this is stormtrooper paintball with an AK-47. It's kind of strange, but still you can have a kind of dual model here. You can say that there's a reference shift because there's always good old reality to fall back on. There's you know, naturally embodied what we see as immediate physical reality, in which your actions make sense as actions. So it's fairly unproblematic. You move pieces around and so on. So it's grounded in physical space. And that is the important premise, it seems to me, that we can operate with this kind of layered model. In my paper, I use Goffman, but I'm not sure if you necessarily need to use Goffman. You can use reference shift, and I'm using the concept of framing, which is one way of addressing this model. But there are other candidates. With real-time games, this is a 3D game. I think it's a racing game. I think it doesn't necessarily have to be immersive 3D and so on, but that's the case. It could be maybe other more limit cases, but let's stick with this. What is there a similar ground here, a similar primary framework? That's a Goffmanian term, the primary framework. A similar level of natural embodied action. Actually, in this particular case, I've just taken it off the internet. In this particular case, there is, because I'm pretty sure that person isn't actually playing. There's something about the way he holds his thumb, or there's something wrong going on. You wouldn't be playing that. So that person is actually acting on the controller. So that would fit Onica's model very. You're acting in the real world, and then something is responding from the screen. But if this person is playing properly, there's something about the what are the intentional objects here? At what are the actions directed? Spatial, visual, shapes. It depends how you look at how you theorize perception. What does it mean to look? So it seems to me that what we could say here is that the simulated nature, the simulated space in the racing game here, is a perceptual premise. It's an absolute. In order to be able to act intuitively, in order to be able to see anything really, you can't see this as shapes on the screen. You need to actually perceive it as what we intuitively, the way we intuitively do it when we play. And one way of articulating that notion of perception, of course, is through phenomenology, that I have also done. This is another plug for the same book. I have a chapter in the book as well about Merleau-Ponty and so on, which is about telepresence. So one way of articulating a strong formulation of this notion of intentionality would be this one. This is a very famous example of the blind man's stick. The blind man's stick has ceased to be an object for him. I guess many of you are broadly familiar with this approach, that in perception and action, the controller is no longer an object, just as much as my hand. If I'm going for a glass of water, someone has been drinking of this. The action is not moving my hand. My own perception is not of moving my hand, but of grabbing, the glass broadly. And but it seems to me that you can do even in a weaker alternative. Even when you just state that action, as long as you state that action is intentional, and if you also state that in order to have intentional action, you need some kind of recognition or intuitive perceptual recognition in order to have action at all. So as long as you have those two premises, it seems to me that it will be very difficult to articulate a kind of ground of action in these kinds of games, a kind of ground in the naturally embodied world where action and perception is actually taking place. You need that kind of that simulated space, virtual space, in order to articulate action and perception, it seems to me. So you don't see actions on the screen, and that is a very important distinction or difference, I think, between mimetic games before we had real-time computing, real-time graphics, and after. So my argument would be that this notion of action, unless you're playing like this person who's like playing in this space here, as Jesper you would say, this argument that you can have a reference shift to reality whenever you act, that argument maybe, I'm not sure about this, but it falls on the account that it depends on a notion of action that you can't really articulate. It's not a valid conception of action, it seems to me. Certainly not in these types of games, and that is what I suggest that we can call virtuality. So the suggestion then would be, well, we have been playing it yesterday. We played a little bit with definitions. Veli-Matti was talking about definitions. So if I'm going to play with definitions of what virtuality, there are many concepts of virtuality. But if I'm going to play a little bit with it, my suggestion would then be, for example, that virtuality is this mimetic activity as ground, as primary framework, when it takes place without any independent anchoring in the naturally embodied world, which means you can't really formulate any, you can't articulate action as proper action independently of what is being simulated on, in this case, a flat screen. So that is, I'm trying to find here some short and quick definitions of what this concept of virtuality is about. It's mimetic activity as ground, or you could, maybe this is better. Virtuality is mimetic activity that goes on in the primary framework, and you can't have mimetic activity going on in the primary framework in natural embodied environment, because then you will run into the direction of fit problem always. There will always be a ground as long as you're not dealing with virtuality. There will always be a primary framework. You could always strip off rather than reference shift. We could talk about stripping off the representational layer, or in Goffmanian terms, we could talk about down keying from the representational frame to what he calls the primary. You can always do that when you're doing mimetic acting. Even in acting, you can strip it down to acting, you know, which would be the ground, the actual thing that is going on. So it seems to me that this, well, I'm just suggesting this as a kind of thing. This is a paradox, and maybe we have to accept virtuality as a paradox. Well, I don't really. I'm not sure about this one. Well, this one is okay. Yeah. So my candidates would be, maybe that one is the one I like best, and of course this one, which you know, I feel I've kind of worked myself into a corner here, which is part of my point with virtuality. You know, you work yourself into a corner. So trying to backtrack from that corner at least a little bit, just tiny suggestions how we can give a positive, because everything I've been saying is a kind of negative definition of virtuality, what it is not and what we have to say in order to. So why do we have this paradox that there exists this realm, this it's not really a frame, but this ontic place where the categorical rule of action versus representation is no longer valid. Why? Well, real time. So reification is one. I changed that title, but reification is one alternative. You have algorithmic objects which in intuitive action, in the act of intuitive perception, is being reified as concrete concrete objects. They're really second-order objects. You know, the visual shapes, they're second-order objects, but they're posing as first-order objects. That's the trick. You know, they're kind of hiding their nature as second-order objects. So you get this almost magical kind of they are objects like any props or objects that we play with, but they are programmed at the same time. So this strange paradox of being concrete and very real, I would agree with you on that, but programmed so that almost as if someone has been breathing life into them, you know? They're kind of animated. And that is a kind of reification into something we can touch. So information has turned into something that we can touch, and a piece of information falls down the cliff, and you know. And it seems to me that this is quite a departure in the history of virtualities and the history of mimesis and history of gaming. That it's something quite significant. That's why I'm using Space War as a background there, because I think this is. I think this is very important, but I'm not exactly sure how. I'm trying to approach it. And information made second nature. This means that this ties in with many cultural associations and histories in terms of science. You know, that in theoretical physics, information is everything and so on, and religion. You know, transubstantiation and all these kinds of. There are lots of ideas and intuitions in our culture about information-made nature, and not just information-made nature, but information-made second nature, like another nature. We have this nature and then another nature. And in my paper, I refer to Philip Bray, that some of you might know, who has his kind of virtual ontology, which has also inspired this my approach. But that's in the paper. Another way of saying it would be my final note. In a certain, it also ties in with perceptions of magic, of enchanted objects, something that is a regular object, but has this kind of infused with something from a designer. It's programmed to behave like an animated object, like an enchanted mountain, for example. So there are these cultural associations also that I think can be linked to this notion of virtuality. That's as far as I've got for now, I think, yeah.
Yeah, I guess I have several problems, but I will just pose a quick couple of them. I'm not sure what your main thesis was, so that might be my fault, but there seemed to be one claim here, and that was that there is a kind of intentional fit between what you intend and what the game is, or the intention shapes the game itself, and there is a fit between your intention and the game. And I wonder if this intentionality we're talking about is the unique criterion here. Well, you had some other arguments, but in this context, yeah. So right. My question is, what kind of criteria for failure do you have? Because I'm thinking about the intentionality in ethics, for instance. You might have the intention to steal the money from an old lady, but in order to do that, you help her off the street. And by helping her over the street, you don't manage to steal her money, but you manage to help her over the street. So in consequence, your act seems good, but your intention was bad. So what kind of criteria do you have here? The second question is the embodied cognition. How do you that has always been my problem with Merleau-Ponty, etc. How do you discriminate between the body and space? I mean, there is a kind of a body and space and body and thought. There is, again, you lack a criterion for distinguishing between the body and the space, and also the body and cognition.
Yes, the last question first, just quickly. Yes, in that approach, that is a lack. I guess that there are notions, of what I'm talking about here is what would broadly be called, subjective space. So objective space, in objective space, the actions are taking place on a controller in relation to a flat screen and all those. So yes, that is just a built-in limitation, I guess. As for the action as being successful, Jon Rikard also talks about, my concept of action is basically tied to the notion of intention, that you act intentionally, whatever the consequences actually are. You're right, doesn't come into it, but you're absolutely right that this is kind of the bone of the argument, because if you choose another approach to what would be valid as real action, then this approach kind of collapses. So it really hangs on when you're acting, intuitively in a way that allows you to play certain kinds of games reasonably successfully. I mean, making any progress at all, or making, when you're doing that, what is valid action? And it falls down if this phenomenologically inspired notion of action is not valid at all. So that is the bone of the argument, yes. I guess my main point is also a negative one, that if you take away what is going on in the game, then I find it very hard to articulate any action in the intentional sense. So I guess, as far as I've come for now, I haven't really given any good positive account of what kind of action I'm talking about. At least not, well, I've written a chapter on it in the book, and I didn't touch upon that, but at least my point here is the negative one. How do you articulate a concept of action independently of what? Because it seems to me that is what Jon Richard did. He's articulating a concept of action. He's trying to crystallize, to find this concept of action independently of what is going on in the game, and hence sees the spatio-temporal shapes on the screen and so on. And for now, I think that is not possible. Yeah, you read the moderator. Yeah.
Thank you, Rune. Again, another very thought-provoking presentation. Start with a cheeky comment. It's just a comment, not a question. I mean, you defined virtuality in terms of negatives. I feel it's like very similar to defining God in Christian theology. So with this, on this godly note, you've brought in transubstantiation, just kind of in passing.
Well, yeah, I did say it myself, so yeah.
I was thinking of consubstantiation, which later Protestants, I mean, post Luther talk about, does the bread and the flesh kind of is the bread the flesh changing to bread, or is it that they're kind of both there? The flesh is in the bread and the bread in the flesh, right? So in that, I mean, I was just applying that kind of comparison to virtuality. What would the real and the virtual kind of play out as?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can answer that, other than I'm hesitant to follow up the implications of my own words here with transubstantiation. But what I'm saying is that the paradox built into what we call virtuality, hence my helplessness in trying to define it, is, I think, there are some very, very interesting associations to these religious paradoxes, and also to incarnation. Christ is 100% man, 100% God, and those things. And you could speculate that this resonance is part of the appeal of, I'm not talking about just game, but about the appeal of this form, and it's part of why people use the pretty stupid term virtual reality. Virtual reality actually makes a lot of sense as long as you understand it from a more cultural perspective. But I would hesitate on drawing any direct links either to religion or to quantum mechanics or anything that are seems to be this information made nature kind of thing. And I don't believe in transubstantiation. No, I'm a Protestant.
Okay, those were the questions we had time for. So please.
I'm sorry for going over time.